Good morning, everyone, and it's always a great delight to be here in Richmond Barracks, and I am absolutely pleased that Ingrid and Corinne have come and joined us here. Have been talking about this lecture for quite a long time, and I'd also like to add my solidarity with all my friends and colleagues who are striking in the UK over precarity and work conditions in the UK universities, and maybe it will be not too long before the Irish universities face similar situations. It has been an interesting journey working with Richmond Barracks, and obviously here in Richmond Barracks we deal a lot with the revolutionary Irish women of the 1912 to 1923 period as we go through this decade of commemorations. But of course, if we look beyond Ireland, there were revolutions happening around Europe at this time, particularly in the post-World War period. So it's going to be very interesting for you who have heard so much about revolutionary Ireland over the last year, if you've been coming to these Mondays at the mess, the men, the women, labour movements, class issues, gender issues, to hear what was happening in Germany, because of course mostly what we hear about Germany in Ireland is about the First World War. And because so many Irish men were in the British Army, and so many Irish women went on nursing duties and first aid duties. And now we're seeing it from the other side. What was happening in Germany post First World War? And obviously some of you would have heard of Rosa Luxemburg. In fact, many of you probably have heard of Rosa Luxemburg. But like most women's history, there were a lot more women involved. And while Rosa Luxemburg was a fantastic woman and a great woman, Corinne and Ingrid are here to tell us about all the different aspects of gender and revolution in Germany after the war. And I'm myself are really looking forward to it. It's an area of history I don't know a huge amount about, but I'm very interested in learning and understanding those connections across Europe and revolution and gender at this time. So welcome to Ingrid and Corinne, and a big Richmond Barracks welcome to them this morning.
Thank you, Mary and Catherine, and thanks so much for inviting us to speak at Richmond Barracks. It's very exciting to be surrounded by all these amazing Irish women. Very, very struck by the contrast with Germany, the way that Germany is commemorating the revolution is more or less they've written women out of it. And Corinne and I have got a long-standing interest in writing particularly political women back into their own history. We found in the commemoration in Britain as well as in Germany that women are there, but only certain types of women, nurses for example, are very big in the commemoration. But as soon as you get onto the political women, you find that they're depoliticized, they're written out, they're overlooked, and they're not given the place that they deserve in history. Now, is this an international phenomenon? It's hard to say, really, but here are some examples. This is the potato revolution in Sweden of 1917. This is even more obscure than the German Revolution, which at least there are publications about. It was initiated and it was carried forward by women, and by women from villages, from rural areas, rather than from urban areas. So when it came to electing representatives and negotiating with the government, these women who'd started the movement were elbowed out, and men were at the front, and the women's political stance was completely forgotten. And if you look there, you can see that it is a crowd of mainly men. Started off 100% women and got a bit more manny as it got nearer to the centre of power. Now, another example are, of course, ones that you'll be familiar with, the women who fought for Irish nationalism in the Easter Rising in 1916 had great difficulty being taken seriously as revolutionaries at the time, to the extent, and this is from Mary's book, I think associated with here, the 77 Women, struck by the fact that the British Army, when they came in and came across women fighters, they assumed that they'd been taken hostage by the British and said, oh my goodness, you know, have they done anything to you? And the women hiding their guns, sort of saying, oh, no, we're quite safe. And then they were able to escape and go off and fight some more. So the real work of the revolution was understood to be the preserve of men. So the combatant at the front is male, and the nurse or the carer at the first aid station is female. Now, one of these women, Helena Maloney, who is up there, which is lovely to see, dismissed the idea that women only got involved because they were in love with some man or looking for excitement or limelight or indulging their vanity, all assumptions that are made about women when they become political, particularly if they're fighting for a cause. And she went on to say that many men seem unable to believe that any woman can embrace an ideal, accept it intellectually, feel it as a profound emotion, and then calmly decide to make a vocation of working for its realization. So politically engaged women are left out of the story. And this is the case in Germany as well, a recognition of the strength of German women's political cultures and their role in shaping the post-war political landscape has been elusive. And it's great to have the chance to be here today and talk about it. And we'll be focusing on the role that women played in the German Revolution of 1918.
Okay, thank you. Right, so I'm aware that this revolution is not necessarily particularly well known, so I'm going to start with a brief overview of how exactly the revolution came about, and then we'll focus in on the women themselves. So in 1914, when war was declared, at least in the press, there was a sense of a swelling of war enthusiasm. People gathered in town squares across Germany, people volunteered to fight in the army or for the women in the women's organisations. But it's unclear how true it was that this represents really war enthusiasm. So at the same time, there were also massive demonstrations for peace. So it's quite a complex story at this particular point. If there was any war enthusiasm, it was definitely very short-lived. The Allied economic blockade was incredibly effective. And this very rapidly led to food shortages. So before the start of the war, Germany had been importing a lot of its food, but because of the economic blockade, they were not able to do this. There was also a poor harvest in 1914, meaning that this food situation is only going to get worse as the war goes on. Germany had also been importing chemicals for use in fertilizers, and again, as a result of the blockade, they were unable to do this. The government's reaction was very reactive rather than proactive. Any measures that they introduced were short-lived, poorly explained, or poorly supported, meaning that they were never able to really get on top of this food situation. The road and rail were prioritized for military use, meaning that the food that was there in the countryside was left rotting in the fields and was not able to get into the cities where it was needed. There was also a sense of a lack of military progress, particularly on the Western Front. So these young men who joined up in great enthusiasm in August 1914, they have the feeling they're sitting around in trenches not really achieving anything. So there kind of starts to be questions, well, what's the point? Why are we doing this? Why are we putting up with these difficulties, these shortages, if it's not going to achieve anything? This then culminated in the winter of 1916-17, which was known as the turnip winter, because there really wasn't that much else to eat. So what we see in Germany is a slow decline in the quality and quantity of food. It's not that people are suddenly starving and dropping dead in the streets. It's just that over time we see the increase in the mortality rate, and people start to die from diseases that we would expect them normally to recover from in peacetime. There's also a decline in the fertility rate as well, so both because so many men are away fighting, but also because the women aren't getting enough to eat, so they're not able to have as many children. The babies that are born tend to be sickly, and again, there's an increase in the mortality rate there as well. So why are people putting up with this when they realize that the government isn't able to do anything about the food situation? Without any children being born or enough children being born, there's no future for the nation of Germany. So why keep going with the war? And this situation very quickly leads to strikes, riots, and violence. People begin to take direct action, to take the matter into their own hands, to protest for peace. In October 1917, we have the Russian Revolution, and this is a real moment of inspiration for Germany. The Russians were broadly seen as the most oppressed people in Europe. And if they could rise up and overthrow the Tsar, why can't Germany do the same thing? And this picture is actually from earlier in the year of 1917. This is from International Women's Day in 1917, which is when the women went on strike and they barricaded the factories and refused to let the men go into work as they demanded peace, bread, and freedom. So this is really inspiration for Germany. So by this point, Germany is ripe for a revolution. They just need a spark. And this spark comes in October 1918, so 1 year after the Russian Revolution. The Naval High Command ordered their sailors out on a final offensive against the Allied forces. And I'll just point on the map where we are. So right up in the north of Germany. So the fleet was stationed about there, and they were ordered out on this big final push, which they knew was a suicide mission. So they knew they were outgunned and going to be outmaneuvered by the Allied forces. So they refused. They refused to follow orders and go out and fight one more time. So they were sent through the Kaiser Wilhelm Canal to the town of Kiel. And put in prison in that town. What happened then was that the town exploded in protest in solidarity. People rose up and protested. They demanded the release of the sailors, but also the end of the war. And these protesters took over the governance of the town and managed to secure the release of the sailors. And this spread incredibly quickly. So this map, you can sort of see from the different colours the different days that it happened on. And it took 2 days to go from Kiel in the north to Munich in the south. So we're right up the top, right down here in the bottom. It took 2 days. So it's incredibly fast. And on the 9th of November, the Kaiser fled and a republic is finally declared. And as we know, the armistice was then agreed for the 11th of November, 1918. And at this stage in the process, it's a relatively bloodless affair. So a few people are killed in Kiel in the initial protests, 7 people shot in total, but the rest of it happens very, very peacefully. But this then changes later on in the revolution when the parliamentary Democrats use troops to quell those who wanted a Soviet-style Räterepublik, and Germany saw conditions approaching civil war.
Okay. Now, the way this story has been told by historians, particularly in Germany, has been very much concentrating on those areas of the revolution where you're not likely to find many women. There were no women in the boiler rooms on those naval ships, for example, and there were no women in the armed forces at the time. But the spark that caused the revolution to go from the top of Germany right down to the bottom, that wasn't just soldiers, that wasn't just sailors. Without the cooperation and without, in fact, the civilian population being primed and ready for this revolution, having in fact been working towards it, almost rehearsing for it on this, in the bread riots and the strikes, then that revolution would not have carried in the same way. So if historians only look in those arenas where you're not going to find women, then of course you can tell the story of the revolution as an exclusively male affair. And there are some historians who are very, very defensive when you tell them that, well, you know, it sounds like a reasonable claim. Women were also involved in the German Revolution. We're not saying German women were leading the revolution and there were no men involved. We're just saying women were there too. And there are some historians who are still claiming that it was exclusively male and getting very, very upset when we point to more and more women who were involved in the revolution. So I hope there's no one here who is a women in the revolution denier. No? Good. Excellent. Because our work is based on first-hand accounts by women. They had been active in politics, they were trade unionists, they were pacifists, they'd worked in women's organizations, and they thought they were there. They thought they were active in the revolution, they welcomed the revolution, and they certainly didn't see themselves as onlookers to a male spectacle. They welcomed the revolution as a possibility, as an opportunity to achieve some of their long-standing political goals, and they hoped that it would bring in a new social order and lay the foundations for a sustainable peace. So looking at the women most likely to be involved, Rosa Luxemburg's already been mentioned. She's got a slide of her own after this as well. But maybe these other two are less well known. Clara Zetkin, who was really the leader of socialist women, and I would say internationally. She was the editor of the influential journal Equality, Die Gleichheit, and she was very, very active internationally and in the peace movement as well, opposing the war. And there's also trade unionist and Socialist Party member Toni Zender, and she played a leading role in Frankfurt. And she's written memoirs, she wrote speeches, she was very, very involved. And Rosa Luxemburg, who is, of course, the most famous of the revolutionary women, this is the last time you'll see her, but she's also over there on the exhibition. And I like an awful lot of what she said, and I like an awful lot of what she wrote, but I think this one here, the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening, is a mantra we can all live by, because you don't need to really make a fuss about things, but just saying, well, you say there were no women in the German Revolution, well, here's one, and here's another one, and here are 256 more. And then you don't really have to get involved in huge amounts of arguments. Okay.
Thank you. So within this group of revolutionary socialist women, we have a large number who are not so well known as these three that Ingrid has mentioned. And as Ingrid just said, our research has found 256 women from the revolution, and we're still working on adding to that number. They were elected members of workplace councils, which is estimated to be about 5% of the representatives. And this dwindles to lower numbers as you go higher in the echelons. Indeed, there were only 2 women among the 489 delegates at the council conference in December 1918. And one of these women, Käthe Loy, began her speech pointedly with an address to the only other female delegate, Clara Noack, saying, "Lady and gentlemen." Some of the women in the database that we've created left virtually no trace. We don't even have their names. We just have the sense that there was a woman as part of this, but we don't know who she was. Others we can track through police reports and court reports, membership of different organisations, articles, correspondence, interviews, biographical sketches or memoirs. And I'm going to give you a few more examples of these women now. So this is Gertrude Völker. She was a lifelong social democrat, and she held an important role in the trade union at the heart of the revolution in Kiel, so where it all started. She left an eyewitness account, which she wrote in 1974. Before the war, she'd been involved in a radical socialist youth group and described as self-conscious and revolutionary, and she claimed the fight for freedom, democracy, for human dignity, social justice, and solidarity as her own struggle. And she went on to have a career in local politics and social welfare policy. Another woman, Hilda Kramer. She was really at the centre of events in Munich. She wrote revolutionary flyers, she discussed strategy with revolutionary leaders, and she was one of the few women who went to Berlin as a delegate of the International Communist Group of Germany in December 1918. And the fact that she's not mentioned by any of the male revolutionaries who knew her and worked with her should give us pause when using male eyewitness accounts as our only sources. And then a third member, so this is another one from Kiel, so again from the starting point of the revolution. This is Martha Riedel. She was only 15 years old in 1918, and she ran messages for the revolutionaries, really risking her life on the streets as bullets were flying in order to ensure that they had a coordinated response across the city.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah, she was one of the characters in the play that was written based on our research as well, very effective, playing as a 15-year-old schoolgirl. There's another group as well, the pacifist feminists, and they'd spent the war years organising and developing their vision for a post-war society based on social justice and democracy. And this is Minna Kauer. She was a radical and progressive campaigner in the middle-class feminist movement. And she kept a diary throughout, which has been published, which is just as well. I tried to read her handwriting, it's almost impossible, but someone before me was able to do that. And she responded to the revolution with tears and with emotion. She says, "I'm overwhelmed with joy. Tears run down my face. Dream of my youth, fulfillment in old age. I will die a Republican." But the best known of the radical women who were involved in the revolution were the lawyer, Dr. Anita Augsburg, and her partner, Lida Gustava Heimann. And they were active in both Hamburg, at the top of Germany, Munich, right down in the south, during the war and the revolution. Heimann was kicked out of Munich for her pacifism and was in Hamburg when the revolution started. They had both been campaigning for political causes on the liberal side of the spectrum since the 1890s. They campaigned against state regulation of prostitution. They campaigned for education for women and girls and against the double moral standard for men and women. And during their campaigning, they'd been confronted by what male power and male rule over women actually meant. And they'd formed the view that men were self-interested, venal and willing to sacrifice women to their own desires and were capable of absolutely anything except rational government. And these women saw their entry into politics as absolutely essential to prevent man-made disasters such as the First World War. And this is what they wrote about the First World War. It's proof that the male state, founded and built up on force, has failed all along the line. The male principle is divisive, and if allowed to continue unchecked, will bring about the total destruction of humanity. And these women embraced the revolution. They were absolutely determined, and they felt entitled to take a leading role and shape the new society along progressive democratic lines. They wrote memoirs in 1941 in exile. They weren't flavour of the month when Hitler came to power. They were on holiday in Switzerland and stayed there, otherwise they would have been killed. And they contain vivid recollections of the revolution in Hamburg and Munich. The first post-war women's meeting, and that was right at the before the armistice had been signed, really. Women could come out of the shadows, and they were free. Now we were free. Now we could talk, they said. And then they made their way to Munich, and they worked for the Republican government there, and wrote, "A new life had begun. At last, women could throw themselves fully into their work. Women's participation was wanted in all areas of politics and society." They were highly critical of the ways in which women were excluded from political life. And this happened after the war with the elections, which for many revolutionary women came way too soon. They came in January 1919, and women had not even been allowed to join political parties until 1908. So they really had very, very little time to prepare for it. And for Heimann and Augsburg, they felt the same old people who'd made the policies that had caused the war were back in power again, and they weren't very polite about them. And they also were very critical of the demobilization practices that privileged soldiers returning and ignoring the women who were being kicked out of the munitions factories, kicked out of their jobs, in favour of men, even when they had dependents to look after and no one really to care for them. And as committed pacifists as well, they intervened in the revolution in Munich, and they tried to make it more peaceful. They appealed, working together with the socialist women, one of the few examples where liberal progressive women and socialist women worked together in the League of Socialist Women. They appealed to the men not to use violence, not to use bloodshed, but actually to work together to create a more peaceful and democratic society.
So to return to our project within this broader historical context, we've been trying to write women back into the history of the revolution and asking questions such as what changes if we take women's revolutionary participation seriously? So one of the things we've discovered is that we broaden the definition of revolution so we can look at the revolutionary context, so the strikes, the food riots, the demonstrations and expressions of anti-war feeling that allowed the revolutionary spark to cross over from this small group of sailors in Kiel to the mass population. And women played a key role in this. They were a major group expressing resistance to World War I, these feminist pacifists that Ingrid just mentioned, and they had a clear vision for a sustainable peace based on principles of social, economic and gender justice. Another thing it does is it redefines what considers as political. Accepting women as revolutionary allows us to see that women's concerns such as bread and peace are indeed deeply political issues that go right to the heart of anti-war politics. It also changes our understanding of what a revolutionary is and can be and allows us to look beyond the wildly romantic man with gun and bandana that hides many revolutionary roles. Through examining women's revolutionary activities, a plethora of revolutionary roles and identities become apparent. From organisational roles to gun running, to giving inspirational revolutionary speeches, to hiding comrades from the authorities, we can find women in a wide variety of roles. And for these women, the revolution was not just a momentary event, a spontaneous decision to risk their lives. It was often the result of years' worth of activism and campaigning. And the revolution was also not the end of this activism. These women went on to have careers in politics, in trade unions, in social work. For some, they joined the anti-Nazi resistance, risking their lives again to fight the state. Others went into exile to provide refuge for their comrades overseas. Hilde Kramer, the 18-year-old Munich revolutionary I mentioned earlier, she worked for the international communist movement in Moscow and in various trade unions in the 1920s. And she's actually one of our favourite revolutionaries, and I'll tell you why in a second. In 1936, she came to Britain, and she wrote documents for the NHS Act in 1945. And after a really long career in British politics, she moved to Otley, which is just on the outskirts of Leeds, to be with her son, who was a University of Leeds professor. And she died there in 1974. So it's nice to have a local connection to someone.
Okay. Yes, so the centenary of the revolution in 2018 offered us an opportunity to intervene in public discourse as well as into academic debate and to uncover some of these news stories and to challenge existing interpretations. But certainly in the German context, we didn't have as much success as we hoped we would have, and the story of women's involvement in the revolution is a story that is not making a huge amount of headway in public historical understanding. And I was working with the Maritime Museum in Kiel, and I hope to influence them to include some of these women in their year-long exhibition. And when I went to see it at the opening, there were women there, but they weren't the revolutionary women. They weren't the political women. They were women who were working on the home front, women who had stepped in to take the place of men as tram conductors, etc. So I was pleased to see those women there, but the story of the revolutionary women, the Gertrud Völker and the Martha Riedel, who were their own, townspeople, were not included. And this is, there was another travelling exhibition that went around all the schools and in public areas, all the little towns as well, in Schleswig-Holstein, where Kiel is situated. And in this exhibition, which is, as I say, it's meant to inspire people to harness their own inner revolutionary and make a moral stand for what they think is right. And not a single example was of a woman who had made a moral stand for what she thought was right. It completely and utterly excluded any active contribution that women had to activist history, and it makes them passive beneficiaries of a democratic history that they played no role, apparently, in bringing about. So the people who put this exhibition together made choices again and again that could have included the voices of women, but they didn't. So in other words, the judgment of those putting the exhibition together, women played no part in the revolution and therefore no part in the democratic transformation of Germany. So this alienates women from their own history, and it can lead you to the idea that campaigning for political change is ineffective, or as women, we just wait for the men to do it, and then we're the beneficiaries of the male revolutionaries, which is not great. So we feel that writing women's cultures into the narrative doesn't just add something to the story, it changes it fundamentally. And it does this by creating a link with women's past that allows them to have a role in today's democracy, politically particularly. So writing these revolutionary women back into German history is important, not because it's the right thing to do. A lot of them made huge sacrifices for their revolutionary commitment. Rosa Luxemburg was brutally murdered in January 1919, and some of the women that we're talking about, they led highly precarious lives, running from one form of persecution to another with none of the stability that many of us enjoy in our lives. So it's important to remember their stories, and to remember too that political gains have never been wrested from the powerful and privileged without vocal, organised pressure and collective action, and that nothing has been won or defended without persistence, often over many decades. Yes, I will.
And the struggle for equality is far from over, with women and girls disadvantaged in terms of recognition, reproductive choices, bodily integrity, healthcare and political representation, and within our own profession in terms of pay, promotion, job security and pensions. Should I do the next one?
Yeah, next one. Yes, so thank you very much for mentioning the facts that we're on strike, and thank you as well for expressing solidarity. The fight that we're in is not just over pay and conditions. It really does feel like it's a struggle for the very heart of higher education in the United Kingdom. The most important threat to our profession is casualisation, precarity, and this disproportionately affects younger, new entrants to the profession who spend years on, sometimes decades in fact, on fixed-term contracts as teachers or researchers or as hourly paid teaching assistants. And so Corinne and I stand together on this, as we do on the picket lines and as we did last year as well, in the hope that, by taking a stand now for as long as it takes, that we can actually rescue the profession and turn the clock back from the direction that it's going, which we believe is highly destructive, not just to the teachers, but also our teaching conditions, our students' learning conditions. And in 2018, as now, a lot of the students are expressing an awful lot of understanding of our cause, particularly when we give them the actual facts and figures about how much of their tuition fees is not being invested in decent working conditions for their tutors, that many of their tutors are on fixed-term contracts or hourly paid, often 0 hours contracts in higher education, which is entirely inappropriate.
Thank you for that. Okay. So to reflect on some of the lessons that we've learnt from our revolutionary studies, the need to tap into our revolutionary roots and to fight for a better world has not gone away, and revolt and resistance look entirely justified and an appropriate response. But one of the things we think is really important is that if you do engage in activism, make sure that you leave some kind of record. And here's a few of the suggestions that we've come up with. We only have access to the political cultures of women because of their own record keeping, their journals, speeches and correspondence, and a whole slew of political memoirs and biographies by and about women that began to appear in the mid-1920s. We found these women largely because they wrote about their experiences, even in the teeth of public ignorance, lack of interest in and persistent omission or distortion of their stories. And also because archivists and librarians and campaigning groups had the foresight to collect these papers and keep them safe for us to find. As well as the exhibition that you can see at the back there, we also worked with a theatre company to create a play where we put the voices of the female revolutionaries centre stage. And this is a photo from the play because I think they all agree the actors look really great and revolutionary here. Through our research, the play and the exhibition, we've been able to challenge the one-sided historical view of the revolution as a purely masculine affair and write women back into post-war revolutionary history. Thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much for that fascinating story. And when I look around the room, I think I still think we have an awful lot of work to do here in Ireland, but I think we're a little bit ahead. We are getting the women written back into history. And perhaps Rosa Luxemburg was the German Countess Markovic, and she became the dominant figure. And when you look behind her, you see so many more. And also, you give her due position. She has an honoured position like Markovic, but it's also a position among many, many other women who were also activists. And so it's been fascinating. I have so many questions. I could take advantage of my position as chair to ask them all, but I shall not. I shall throw it open to the audience because I'm sure you have some questions as well.